There is a class of people history almost never talks about. Not the emperors, not the senators, not the generals who won wars or lost them. The people history forgets are the ones in the middle. The grain merchant who built his business over 20 years, the artisan who owned his workshop and employed 3 men, the soldier who served 15 years and saved his pay, the small landowner who fed his family and paid his taxes on time every year without fail. These people existed in Rome by the millions. They were the backbone of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever produced. And between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, the Roman financial system quietly, legally, and systematically destroyed them. Not through war, not through plague, through money. More specifically, through what happens to money when the people who control it begin using it as a tool for short-term survival instead of long-term stability. Through inflation, through debasement, through price controls that backfired, through tax systems that protected the powerful and crushed the ordinary, through a slow, grinding process that took everything the Roman middle class had built and turned it into worthless metal tokens and unpayable debts. And the reason this story matters today, the reason it matters right now in 2026 in the United States and Europe, is not because it is interesting ancient history. It is because every single mechanism that destroyed the Roman middle class is operating somewhere in the modern financial system right now. Sometimes under different names, sometimes under the same ones. This is the story of how Rome's middle class was erased, and it begins not with a crisis but with a coin. The Roman denarius was once one of the most trusted currencies in the ancient world. At its peak, it contained approximately 90% silver. It was stable, recognizable, and accepted from Britain to Egypt. Merchants built businesses around it, soldiers saved it, contracts were written in it. An entire integrated economy of hundreds of millions of people rested on confidence in that small silver coin. And then Rome started shaving it, not suddenly, not obviously. The debasement of the Roman denarius was one of the most gradual, deliberate, and consequential monetary decisions in human history. It began as a necessity. Wars were expensive, frontiers were long, armies needed to be paid. And the easiest way to pay more soldiers without actually having more silver was to put less silver in each coin while keeping the face value the same. This is the oldest trick in monetary history. You do not need more money if you can make the money you have go further by quietly making each coin worth less. The soldier gets paid, the bill gets covered, the emperor looks solvent. And for a short time, everyone is satisfied. But here is what the Roman treasury understood and chose to ignore. Every time you reduce the silver content of a coin, you are making a silent promise to every person who holds that coin that you will pay them back less than you borrowed from them. Because that is what money is. It is a promise. And a promise made with 90% silver that gets repaid with 50% silver is a broken promise, even if the number on the coin never changes. The Roman denarius started at roughly 90% silver under Augustus. By the reign of Commodus in the late 2nd century, it had fallen to around 70%. By the mid-3rd century crisis, it had collapsed to below 5% in some issues. At one point, Roman coins were essentially bronze discs with a thin silver wash, worth almost nothing in precious metal terms, but still legally required to be accepted as full payment. And this is where the Roman middle class started dying, because here is what inflation actually does to a society when it runs deep and long. It does not hurt everyone equally. It redistributes wealth invisibly, silently, from the people who hold cash savings to the people who hold real assets, from the people who saved in coins to the people who owned land. From the artisan with money in his strongbox to the senator with 10,000 acres of farmland that kept its value regardless of what happened to the coins. The grain merchant who spent 20 years building savings in denarii watched those savings become worthless as the silver content collapsed. The artisan whose wages were nominally raised to keep pace with rising prices found that his real purchasing power kept falling because the coins he was paid in bought less every single month. The soldier who served 15 years and saved his military pay found that by the time he left service, his savings could barely buy what half that amount would have bought when he started. Meanwhile, the senator with land felt almost nothing. Land does not debase. Land produces grain, which commands whatever price the market sets. Land can be rented, taxed, leveraged, and passed down. Land is the asset class that benefits from inflation because everything priced in the inflating currency eventually has to pay more for what land produces. This dynamic inflation redistributing wealth upward toward hard assets and away from cash savings is not an ancient phenomenon. It is the central wealth transfer mechanism of the modern era. Every period of serious inflation in modern history has produced the same result. Those who hold property, commodities, and equity gain. Those who hold cash savings lose. Rome did not discover this pattern. Rome demonstrated it at civilizational scale. But Rome's financial crisis did not stop at debasement. It accelerated through a series of compounding decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation and were catastrophic in combination. In 215 AD, the Emperor Caracalla introduced a new coin called the antoninianus. It was nominally worth 2 denarii, but contained barely 1.5 denarii worth of silver. On paper, this looked like a practical solution to a shortage of smaller denominations. In practice, it was institutional fraud. The government was minting coins it declared worth 2 of something while delivering less than 2 of that something in actual metal. Soldiers and suppliers were not fooled for long. When those receiving payment began refusing to accept the antoninianus at face value or demanding more coins in exchange for the same goods, Rome had discovered something that every government which has tried to outrun inflation through currency manipulation eventually discovers. You cannot fool a market indefinitely. The market will price the truth eventually regardless of what the coin says on its face. Grain prices in Roman Egypt, one of the most thoroughly documented economic records from the ancient world, rose by orders of magnitude between the 2nd and 4th centuries. Not by 20%, not by 50%, by multiples of 10, 20, 100 in some commodities. The purchasing power of ordinary Roman citizens for basic food collapsed so completely in some periods that historians describe it not as inflation but as monetary disintegration. And here is where Rome made its most catastrophic mistake. In 301 AD, the Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, one of the most ambitious and disastrous economic interventions in ancient history. The edict set legal maximum prices for hundreds of goods and services across the empire: bread, meat, wine, wages, transport, all of it frozen at government-mandated ceilings in an attempt to stop the runaway price increases that were destabilizing cities. The result was immediate and predictable to anyone who understands markets. Merchants and producers who could not sell at the mandated prices simply stopped selling. Goods disappeared from official markets and reappeared in black markets at whatever price the buyer was willing to pay. Shortages multiplied. The edict made the crisis worse in almost every region it was enforced. Diocletian had tried to fight inflation with law. And the market responded the way markets always respond to price controls. It went underground. The middle class bore the full weight of this failure. The wealthy could access black markets, barter networks, and alternative stores of value. The powerful had tax exemptions and state connections that insulated them from the worst pressures. The poorest had almost nothing to lose. But the merchant, the artisan, the smallholder, the soldier, the people who had built savings, maintained businesses, and operated in the formal economy, found themselves trapped between inflated costs, controlled prices that made their goods unprofitable to sell, and tax obligations that the state refused to reduce. And the tax system itself was actively making things worse. Because as Rome's monetary system fragmented, the state increasingly demanded taxes not in debased coins, but in kind, grain, animals, labor, military supplies taken directly from communities. This system, called the Annona Militaris, was brutal for small producers. A large landowner could absorb the loss of a portion of his harvest. A small farmer with barely enough to feed his family and pay his workers could not. Tax gaming and exemptions that powerful interests had secured for themselves meant that the burden fell disproportionately on exactly the middle-tier property owners and merchants who were already being destroyed by inflation. The result was urban flight on a massive scale. Artisans and smallholders who could no longer sustain their businesses in cities abandoned them for rural areas where they might at least grow their own food. The vibrant urban middle class that had built Rome's internal economy, the workshops, the small merchants, the service providers, began contracting. Cities that had hummed with commercial activity started shrinking. The integrated market economy that made Roman civilization extraordinary began fragmenting into isolated local economies that could barely feed themselves. By the time the Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476 AD, the middle class that had existed 4 centuries earlier was largely gone. Not killed, not enslaved, economically erased. Their savings had been inflated into worthlessness. Their businesses had been made unviable by price controls and tax burdens. Their land had been absorbed by the large landowners who survived every crisis because they held real assets instead of monetary ones. Their place in Roman society had been quietly eliminated by a financial system that rewarded proximity to power and punished ordinary productive effort. The historian who studies this does not find a dramatic villain. There was no single emperor who decided to destroy the middle class. There was no conspiracy. There was simply a series of short-term decisions, each one made under pressure, each one seeming necessary at the time, that collectively created a financial environment where the ordinary, productive, saving, working middle class could not survive. That pattern, short-term monetary decisions creating long-term structural damage to the middle class, is not a Roman pattern. It is a human pattern, and it does not require ancient Rome to demonstrate it. It requires only a currency that loses purchasing power faster than wages rise, a tax system that relieves the powerful while squeezing the ordinary, and a financial environment where holding real assets beats building real things. Rome's middle class did not see it coming. They were too busy building businesses, saving money, paying taxes, and trusting a system that was quietly consuming the foundation beneath them. The vault has been open this whole time. The only question is whether you are looking at what is inside it.